Welcome to the Science and Beers podcast with me, Michael McGee. Talking science and drinking beers with researchers down at the pub. So join us with a brew and let's cheers to science. Welcome back to the Science and Beers podcast. It's been a few weeks since our last episode. There was a little bit of a break there. I was particularly busy organising an art and science festival here in Odense, but we're back now and you'll have 3 more episodes of the podcast before the summer break. This time I'm talking with Professor Nina Bonderup Dohn. She is a professor in learning and ICT at the Department of Design and Communication at the University of Southern Denmark. So the University of Southern Denmark is divided out into 6 campuses around Denmark. The main campus is in Odense, but Nina works out of Campus Kolding. And the campus itself is absolutely stunning. It's full of beautiful colours, wide open spaces, and triangles. It's a podcast here, so you're going to have to Google it if you want to get a look at Campus Kolding. So Nina is also a member of the Danish Institute for Advanced Study, where she is a senior fellow of humanities. So her background is quite interesting. She's a physicist. She's worked a little bit with biology. She's a philosopher. She's an educational philosopher or an educational researcher. So I'm going to be talking with Nina about education, really, about my own experience with education and about her research. We sat down with a couple of IBAs over in Campus Kolding and we had a nice chat. Please help us share the word of the podcast, recommend it to a friend, give us a review, particularly if you're listening on iTunes, or share it on social media pages. I'm your host, Michael McGee. Cheers to science. Nina, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you for bringing the beers.
Yes. We have a couple of delicious IPAs from the Abeltoft Gå Brewery in Northern Jutland, so cheers.
Cheers.
They're still a little bit cold after the walk up here.
They're perfect.
Yes.
They shouldn't be too cold. Then you can't really taste them.
Is that right there?
Yeah.
So you are an educational researcher. Would that be the right way of defining
That would be one way of putting it, yes.
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking about this on the way over here, that a lot of people at school, there's a classic example, say, with mathematics. You're learning these crazy algebraic equations, and you're able to do it whenever you're 14. But I remember at school you're thinking, when will I ever use something like this?
Yeah.
So that's one example. Everybody goes through an education, but it's the question about, do we go through education to learn something that helps us navigate the world, or do we go through an education to pass exams? My own experience, now it's getting longer and longer ago, where I went to school as a teenager. We learned things to remember specific facts, so then we could bring them up in the June exams.
Yeah.
And I came to Denmark 9 years ago to go to university, and now I'm actually working with young people's education, teenagers' education in Denmark, and it seems to be the process isn't necessarily how many facts can you remember here in Denmark. It's, you have a problem, how do you actually solve it? And then in doing that, you're not just passing exams, you're really moving education out of the classroom into the real world.
That's our aim. I'm not sure every student will always experience it that way, but we certainly, and I mean, this has been the aim for decades, to focus less on facts and more on problem solving and motivation involved in actually raising a problem yourself, not just having your teacher formulate a problem, but finding problems yourself, because that way you get committed to it in a much stronger sense than you per se will do if your teacher poses a problem.
Yeah, I'm science. I'm into science. I studied science, and I remember again as a teenager you had the predefined experiments in physics,
Cookbook,
for example. You know, you
have experiments,
the Cookbook experiments, and you just follow the procedures, and you end up with the result that the teacher knew was going to happen at the start.
Yeah, and if you didn't, then you made a mistake. Yeah.
We got this result, that's the wrong result.
Yeah.
Well, that's not science. So even at science, as a teenager, I wasn't learning the scientific method.
So no, and in that sense, I mean, in Denmark and also in many other countries, there's been a move towards inquiry-based teaching and learning instead, so that instead of learning facts and having really cookbook exercises, you want to formulate more open questions where the students can actually do a project of their own, where you as a teacher may probably know what the answer is, but it's still more open, also because you don't know what the question will be. So even if you know once they've posed a question what the answer will be, then it'll still be more of their question.
Am I just old, or was there a point in Denmark where it was also the cookbook?
It's still the cookbook in many places. I mean, there's been a movement towards the inquiry-based, and there are many projects like that, but there's certainly also quite a lot of cookbook exercises in school as it is now. And you could say there are also reasons why you would want them, simply for training in laboratory procedures that might be easier to do in cookbook exercises, where you sort of learn how to handle each measurement instrument. But that said, I think it's simply also because it requires a lot of both teachers and students to do inquiry-based projects, and sometimes it's simply easier for both teachers and students in the short run to do the cookbook exercises. But we have had this movement from within all subjects, not just natural sciences, but within all subjects, that students have to do some larger projects where they actually formulate the projects themselves. So you will still find cookbook exercises, but I think you're asking for when did we stop having only cookbook exercises, and that's I think that would have been 40 years ago. That you started having the more open projects.
And that's how people acquire the skills necessary to go out and critically think about the world.
Yeah, I mean...
So critical thinking is a huge part of it, I guess.
Yes, exactly. And you get to at least... I'm sort of hesitating a bit because I don't like to think of I don't believe in critical thinking as one thing, that you can simply learn critical thinking as a competence in itself. I'd rather say you're always critically thinking about something, and being critically investigative in physics is not the same as being it in philosophy. So, but of course, there's somewhat of the same pattern to it, asking, not just accepting what is there in the book and raising questions like that. You could say is something that cuts across, but that's simply at a too superficial level to actually talk about it as a competence. So I'd rather say it's a question of engaging students in a more holistic way in the kind of work you would also do as a scientist, or at least as someone engaged with the subject as a profession. So because you don't learn, when you work in science, you don't work on one small task at a time. You work on larger tasks, and you have to fit your competences together to that larger task, and that's more what they do when they do projects. At least when the projects work well, because they don't always. You'll have projects that where students, if they are simply not motivated at all, then they can't come up with a problem formulation. They'll end up asking the teacher to give them one, and so it can fall apart in various ways. So it's not like you could say that that's sort of the way to simply save everything, save the world. Because there are also studies that show that that the students for whom it works best are those students who have the best outset to begin with, who come from social classes where have parents who are academics, come from higher social classes, whatever word you would like to use about that.
So, as an educational researcher, you're looking into different teaching methods and strategies. Maybe comparing different countries to find what is the best way to educate young people?
What are good ways to?
What are good ways? Yeah.
Yeah, I would very much not like to say that something is the best way, because it will always be really context dependent. What is a good way in certain respects? I mean, one example that you find also in you find both in the educational system and also in teaching and learning in organizations, that when you go to cultures that are not as in Denmark, there's a very low degree of asymmetry between teacher and students. So students will confront teachers and say that's wrong. Mm-hmm. And in countries where that's not the way they have been trained to go through the educational system, you can't expect them to do that. And if you ask them to do that, then they will feel really uncomfortable. So, inquiry-based teaching works better if you've already established a culture of actually inquiring.
Yeah, I have only very recently got to see teenagers at school in Denmark, because I started a job to bring more science in your free time in Denmark, so encouraging teenagers to come do some experiments on a Tuesday evening, which just the fact that job exists, I think, speaks volumes about the local culture here. Yeah. But it was also super interesting for me to see how they do interact with the teachers, and they call the teachers by the first name. Yeah. There's no uniform, it seems to be more of a conversation that they tend to have.
Yeah. Definitely.
And it's quite different from where I came from, where you had the uniform, everybody was called sir or miss.
Yes.
You can't talk back. You can't say that that's wrong for sure.
Yeah. And I can tell you, it's a shock for Danish kids when they go to... My kids went to Australia to school for half a year, and having to wear a school uniform was not very... Well, I mean, they did, and of course they did. They had to. But it suddenly came up very quickly when they came home.
Yeah. I'm really curious about the history of education, because it goes back a long time. It's state controlled. I feel that it used to be in Great Britain, Ireland at least, it used to be designed to get people to go to university at some point, so that perhaps they can then give back to society. They start earning some money, goes back into the tax system. Forgive me if I'm wrong here, I'm not an educational researcher, but is that still the what is the aim of a society to educate?
I think, actually that used to be, or it's more like that now than it used to be, because Bildung, as it would be called in German, formation is the closest we can get in English. Dannelse in Danish is something that is really, really important in both Denmark and the Scandinavian countries, and coming from Germany and the continental tradition. So our understanding of what the aim of school is, it's about letting children develop into citizens that can participate, and into whole beings, into persons. They can form a formation of the person is what it is. The main aim, or has traditionally been seen as the main aim of school, whereas recently, within the past decades, the competition societies, as it's called, at least in Denmark, has changed that a bit. So, which you can also see with 20 years ago was when we started to have to formulate our goals in terms of learning objectives in knowledge, skills, and competences that you would aim for. Before that, you would have much more vaguely expressed, not that they were vague, but about formation of the person. You will still find that in folkeskolen, in their goals, that it's also about the formation of the person. But you will also find specific goals for each subject. And that has been a shift that has come through an internationalization of the Danish way of thinking about education, for better and worse.
Well, that sounds really positive, that formation of the person. It sounds like a really nice thing to do. And it seems that if people have a passion for any kind of area in their education system here, that they can pursue it. It could be sports, it could be academia. But then, if they have a real passion for something at university, they do need to get the grades, and they do need to push themselves that way to be able to get accepted there. And there's only a certain number of spaces.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's also another reason why you'll find that a focus has shifted from the formation to the actual delivery of competence, of documentation that they have competences, because otherwise they won't be able to pursue what they want.
Yeah.
So I mean, there are good sides and bad sides to the very much larger degree of formulation of goals that we have nowadays. It's easier for students to see what is expected of them than it was 40 years ago when you would, or 50 years ago when you would go to, you'd have two exams basically at the university. You would have your basic level exam and your major level exam, and so you basically had to know the whole curriculum for 2, 3, 4 years.
Yeah.
By heart.
Yeah.
And obviously that's difficult.
Well, some incredibly bright problem-solving people just find it very difficult to remember things. Like
exactly.
Remember facts.
And of course, I mean, if you find some basic facts within science, basic equations, you basically need them because it'll slow you too much down if you have to look them up every time. So even if when you're working as a problem solver, it'll be iterative back and forth, and you'll get ideas, and then you want to work with them and develop them. And if you have to look up basic equations every time, that'll simply slow you too much down. But on the other hand, knowing every fact out by heart is not really going to get you through the problem solving either. Yeah. And I'm sort of in the middle, because you do need to have a background you can draw on. If you don't have that, then there's simply not enough to be ingenious about, and it'll slow you too much down. But on the other hand, you don't get ingenious just by facts alone. So and definitely in sort of the olden times where facts was all that was looked at, you did actually had no indication whether somebody would be able to pursue a scientific career, because you didn't ask them to do what is actually required for that.
Yeah. I'm sorry to say, but I've met some on Ph.D. courses. I've met some people who clearly were very good at remembering facts, but didn't really have any of the problem-solving skills necessary to convert hours to minutes or things like that. I'm really curious about your own history, your own background, because it was hard for me to get a full idea about your background, because it seems to be very diverse. There's some physics in there. There's some computer science. There's some biology. There's some. There's some.
Yeah. Now where is the red thread? So I'll tell my story backwards, because that's always. I'll tell it from now and backwards, because that's the way you can make most stringent sense of what has happened. But right now, I would say, you asked me whether I was an educational theorist or educational researcher, and that's one way of putting it. I said, and that's because if you ask me how I would describe my research field, I would say that I'm an educational philosopher who bridges philosophy and learning, and I do that both theoretically and pragmatically, didactically. So I ask both really philosophical questions like what is knowledge, and how can philosophy contribute to other sciences about knowledge. I also ask really practical questions like how can you use a wiki in teaching. How can you use a wiki, Wikipedia, but writing a wiki, writing interest for a wiki. Mm-hmm. How can you use that for teaching and learning? Yeah. So I ask sort of really specific pedagogical questions and really large philosophical ones, and anything basically in between, as long as it's got something to do with knowledge and learning. Yeah. I did say I was an educational philosopher, and that's because I built the bridge, but I built it from the side of the philosophy. So I was educated as a philosopher, that's my major subject, and I have physics as my minor subject. As you know, here in Denmark we have two subjects, so that's the most usual, and I chose physics as my minor subject, basically because at the time I was mainly in what really fascinated me in philosophy was philosophy of science, and I felt I needed to know more about the science that I was to philosophize about. Otherwise, it would become at too superficial a level. Mm. Physicists don't like it when I say it, but I'm saying that I took physics as my ethnographic study to be able to do philosophy.
Not many people would come up with that sentence.
No. And of course I also engaged in. I did physics as a physics student, but I also used. So I engaged fully in the community of learning physics. Mm. But it has also it has also helped me in the philosophizing, and it also triggered my interest in knowledge because. physics textbooks, if they're good, you would expect the theory to be in there, and you'd expect that if you understand what's written in the book, then you understand what physics is about, because we think physics is a really articulated subject.
It's a precise science.
A precise science, and you can say everything there is to say, right? And then you get to the back of the chapter, and there are all these exercises, and you can't solve them. So what is it that you lack? If the textbook is good, then it should be in the textbook. Of course, I've had heaps of bad textbooks, but I've actually also had really good textbooks. And still, there'll be the gap that you get to the exercises and you still can't do them. And then you go to the examples in the book, and sometimes you say, oh wow, yeah, that's it. This looks like that one. It has to be solved with that one as an exemplar or paradigm. And so there's something that what triggered me philosophically is there's so much tacit knowledge in science.
Tacit knowledge?
Tacit knowledge. Knowledge you can't say. You can point at it perhaps to somebody who's already in it. You can say to a student who can't solve a problem with a brick going down a slope, you can say, try and look at the pendulum problem and see if you can see something similar. But to somebody who's not already understood the pendulum problem and seen what the pendulum problem is in a specific way, that's no help at all, and vice versa. So there's a lot of knowledge in science that is background knowledge, and actually I would say that what we do articulate and what we can articulate is the tip of the iceberg, but our understanding of that tip is tacit and is beneath the waters, what we can't see. And so that set me going on doing my master's thesis on what is knowledge and different forms of knowledge and how do they relate. And then I did my PhD on how do we actually learn that. And then I got really intrigued by the fact that since I think so much knowledge is tacit, and I had some already back in the late 90s interesting experiences of ICT-based learning working. And I mean, at that time we weren't talking about Zoom or anything. We were talking about students writing questions in a discussion forum and teachers answering. But that there could be, that definitely didn't happen always, but you could have an experience of really being close with your students. And the students had the same experience with the teacher, because you were so focused on it. And so that triggered me. How does that speak to my tacit knowledge?
It was this ICT education. It was still teacher to student, but via computers.
Yeah, and it would be a class of students.
Yeah.
So I mean, basically, like you'd have your old-fashioned discussion forum, the kinds you can still find, except that they have all kinds of possibilities of uploading extra stuff. But the kind of Reddit, for example.
Yeah, that's super helpful for me if I have some kind of strange question. I go to Reddit.
Yeah. But at that time, you could have distance teaching where students would, or like with Blackboard, it wasn't Blackboard that we used, but it could have been Blackboard. They would upload the assignments, and we would have a discussion
Blackboard,
forum.
by the way, would be the platform that the University of Southern Denmark uses to communicate with students.
Yeah, except that now we've changed to its learning at SDU, but the learning management system.
Yeah.
But Blackboard has, as a learning management system, has many more possibilities than just having a discussion forum between teachers and students and upload of assignments. So but basically at the time what you would have is an upload of assignments and somewhere where you could pose questions that only your teacher and your classmates could see, but not all other people. So that kind of closed forum. Yeah. And what triggered me was that you could really, if you had group discussions, you could also make minor groups within the larger group of the class, and you could really have a feeling of being close with each other about what the subject what you were discussing in a way that doesn't always happen in class. Well, it doesn't always happen here either, but what triggered me was, if I believe so much knowledge is tacit, then how does it work in this very articulate environment? And that sent me, that was a main reason why I applied for the position that I got as assistant professor here, which was within information science, humanistic information science, where I was able to pursue this question.
Yeah.
So that was sort of a bit of back and forth.
Yeah.
Philosophy drives me. I find a lot of questions of philosophical interest within many empirical sciences.
Well, it's super interesting. It was maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I was at a DS talk with a researcher from England. I can't remember his name, but he was talking about creativity, and he was comparing, because if I think, and many people think creativity, they're thinking the arts, they're thinking music, they're thinking dance, culture, but he was making the case that there's just as much creativity involved in science, but it's never taught. We never have a creative course. We're just told, okay, these are some work tools, and then you have to make that jump yourself whenever you see a problem. Then you say, okay, I can use these work tools to design an experiment to test the theory. But there's that creative part that's missing in the education.
Definitely. Yeah.
Whereas you go over to the arts, and it's all about honing in your creativity.
Yeah.
So I was really blown away by that talk, because I never thought about it before, but it was completely obvious whenever he said it out loud.
Yeah. And you could say that part of the tacit knowledge I'm talking about, part of it is also what is involved in that creativity. I mean, not that, but some of it is also just simply understanding what the words mean. So that you can actually transfer not just you don't just have the theory of Newton's 3 laws, but you actually know what they mean in practice with trolleys and stuff, and see how you get from the facts of the theory to the problem solving of actual engagement.
Mm-hmm. Is this something that you're researching, or you're actively engaged in trying to bring into the official education system, this embracing creativity in the sciences and transforming knowledge from the classroom into society?
Definitely the latter. I'm very focused on school not being for the sake of school, but school being for the sake of or school for students being for the sake of them actually getting competences that they can use afterwards, and making the gap between school and work life easier for them to bridge, and making helping them learn things that are actually useful for them later on. And it doesn't have to be sort of one-on-one. You can use this specific formula in that. You talked about your mathematics, the algebra you did, and you couldn't necessarily see where you would use that, and that's very specific. Where can I use this for that? But basically more sort of the mindset of seeing what you're doing not as only doing it for the next exam, but seeing an authenticity to it, for it actually to be useful in different contexts, and for you to learn to shift perspective between contexts, I think is really important. So that you don't just learn whatever is needed for your exam, but that you do projects with businesses or organizations where you actually work with the problems that are out there, not the ones that are set by your teachers, so that you also experience both the positive and the negative sides of there being one you are accountable to. And when I say that's got negative sides to it as well, it's also that you can't necessarily spend as much time on it as you would like. You have to be finished by 1st of June or middle of April, if that's when the business needs its and that's the way it is in life afterwards as well, and that I think it's important to see school as sometimes we can use school as a place where we don't have the same pressures as you do in outside world. You have other kinds of pressures, but it's also really important to help the students do the bridging, so that it doesn't become a silo confinement. But it's also important, of course, to notice the strength that school has, that you can actually spend time reflecting that you don't necessarily have when you get out of school afterwards.
Whenever there's deadline after deadline after
deadline. Yeah, exactly. And you see that with many master students who have taken, I mean, not what we call masters in Danish, students who have already taken a degree and who've been out working for some time in the working life. And then they want to take an extra degree, and they are hungry to actually have the time for reflection They're also hungry sometimes for degrees that they need in their further life, and there can be many motivations, but very many of them really just enjoy the time that they can have for reflecting, because they don't find the time for that in the working life. So and that's something that school definitely can also be. It can be a secluded place where you're allowed to spend time to reflect. And with the way that we have been put under pressure, and the students have been put under pressure to finish quicker, that has that is a serious thing that has been put under pressure in our educational system, as it is in these years, and that's a shame. When I look around at my colleagues, I don't think any of us have done our degrees in the time we were supposed to. It's not because we've been a bit lazy. When I, as I said, I have philosophy as my major subject, and I have physics as my minor subject, and I had done all of my philosophy without, except the master's thesis, and then I did my physics. So I felt that I needed some time to get back into philosophy before I wrote the dissertation. But I didn't want just to go back and take more courses with the teachers I already knew. So I spent a semester at Constance in Germany, which was, with the government, with the way it is looked upon today, it was wasted, because I had no exams I could convert because I passed all my exams already. But it was certainly, I wouldn't have been here today if I had not done that, because that was what really triggered my master's thesis question, which, as I said, described before, was what led to me coming here.
Change your path completely.
Yeah, exactly. So those 4 months, from my point of view, were some of the best invested 4 months ever for me, and So I think most of my colleagues will tell you quite similar stories.
I remember reading my old supervisor's Ph.D. thesis, and there's something like 19 papers published. Today there's a limit of 3 years, and you're not going to get 19 papers published in 3 years.
No, definitely not. No.
So you shouldn't rush it. But then the people that are above you in the hierarchy, how do they measure? How do they measure these sabbaticals? How do they measure?
That's difficult. But I mean, it's just been. It might have been too lenient at the time, but it's definitely too harsh now. You're simply forcing everyone to be at most a mediocre. No, that's pushing it too harsh. But you are facilitating that it's difficult to get past the mediocre because you don't have time for it. But of course, you can. I mean, that's not saying that everyone who spent a year or a year and a half writing a master's thesis at the time, that they wrote great master's theses and that they were not lazy. Some of them perhaps were. I don't know. I'm just saying that you don't have the same possibilities of actually delving into something that really interests you within the time pressure that we have at the moment.
So you mentioned earlier on a question that I've never thought to ask. What is knowledge? I've never thought to even define knowledge. Would you care to do that?
Yeah, sure. I would say that knowledge has 3 aspects, and that they're closely interrelated. And those are one is know that, what we can articulate, articulable knowledge. And the second is practical skill, you would say in English, practical knowledge. You can also call it know-how, how to do things. And the last one is personal experience, or just experience, knowing what it's like. And I'll give you a couple of examples that are really sort of basic, and that's so you can say, well, it's much larger than that in science, and of course it is, but just to sort of illustrate what they mean. If I don't know if you've ever tasted kangaroo.
I have.
You have? Well,
I have.
Let's say something you have.
Made me quite jumpy.
Have you tasted dog?
I have not.
Yeah? Then I can tell you, because I have, that that was in China many years ago when it was still something you were allowed to do. So I've done nothing. They and me have done nothing illegal, but I've tasted dog, and I can tell you that it's got really sort of it's got a bit of a harsh timber to it, and it gets you heated in the way that beer does to it. That's actually a bit intoxicating. Now that is how you can now maybe sort of imagine what it's like, because you have other tastes that I can compare it to. I can say it tastes, it's a bit more harsh than cow meat would be, but it's sort of in that direction.
Is it gamey?
Yeah, gamey. Yeah, but it's sort of tickles your tongue more. Sort of it prickles. So it. The point is, I can say something about it, so I can articulate something. But if you don't have the experiences that I'm trying to articulate it against, then you still don't get what I'm saying. So if I'm telling you that a clarinet, that an oboe sounds something like a duck, then that makes sense if you've heard a duck, and now you're laughing. You know what an oboe sounds like. So, but if you had no idea what a duck sounded like, then it wouldn't help you at all. So if a person who can't see colors, it doesn't help me to help that person to say that red looks something like orange, just darker, because they can't see orange either. So and so those are basic examples of having what you could say the experience of something is a kind of knowledge that you can't describe. You can describe something like similar to it if people have got those experiences, but then you're still drawing on their experiences. Yeah. So in that sense, that's the experiential knowledge. The practical skill also, the skill of knowing, for example, how to drive a car. If you know how to drive a car, then you will see movements of the truck in front of you in different ways. You'll see, you may not even be able to see what it is in the movement of the truck. You'll just see, that looks as if it's going to run out into my lane now. I think I'll just hold back. Yeah. So, of course, you can articulate that, but you can't necessarily articulate what it is about, the way it was driving, because it's your skill of actually driving and taking other.
You're not doing the Newton equations in your head as you're assessing the
exactly
where it's going to end up.
Exactly, and even if you were, that would probably not help you. That would distract you. One of the good examples of that is if you ask people. I'll ask you now, if you are on your bike and you start toppling towards, you start sort of losing your balance towards the right. What do you do with your steer? Do you do steer towards the right or to the left?
I steer towards the left.
No, you don't. Then you fall.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
I had to actually pretend that I'm on the bike here. I actually, for the listener, I have two hands on my imaginary handlebars, and I'm veering to the right.
Yeah. Yes. And that's showing that you have some knowledge that is bodily knowledge, that is a skill knowledge, and you know exactly what to do on the bike. And you can also simulate it now when you're. I look at you and you have
my imaginary handlebars here.
Yeah, but if I just ask you, then your articulated knowledge is not knowledge; it's wrong.
That's a very good example, Nina.
Yeah.
Wow.
And you know the pin codes. They're also a simple example of it.
Sometimes I have to have the keypad in front of me to get the
exactly.
key.
So as I see it, those three different aspects of knowledge, or the three knowledge kinds, you could call them, they melt together into one perspective on the situation, which lets the situation stand out with what is important in the situation. And one example of that is Polanyi talks about what medical students learning to see the lungs on an X-ray photo, what they're doing, how that plays together. He doesn't use exactly the same terms as me, but I'll explain it in my terms, and he's saying basically the same in other terms. But when you start looking at an X-ray, you really don't see anything but the ribs. I still haven't really seen much but the ribs. But the more pictures you see, you get to see the lungs, and the textbook knowledge of different traits and the way that different traits can look different in different people, the natural variation you've got, and how to differentiate that from actual signs of illness is something you learn, where you learn to see at the same time where you learn the meaning of the words that you're using, and it's a skill of learning to see. So you get in. That's an example of the experience and the skill of getting the experience and the actual textbook knowledge. Yeah. That they fit in, they fit together in one.
Yeah, that's interesting. So these three aspects of knowledge. I just want to finish with one thing. So whenever we're kids, whenever we're 5, everybody's an artist and a scientist. They're creating, they're painting, they're licking things, touching things. They're asking why, and then we lose this. Is the education system to blame for losing being an artist and being a scientist?
Oh, that's a too hard question. That's not a yes or no question. I mean, part of no, I'd rather pass on that one because I mean that it's too complex to answer in a short beer and drinking the last sips of the beer.
Especially if we're referring to the entire world as well, it's too complicated. Yeah, but it's interesting to think back, and think we were. That is where the batteries on my handheld recorder ran out of juice. But I finished the conversation with Nina just shortly after that, just by reflecting on how artistic and curious we were as children, and thinking about a lot of us might have lost this on the way. But not the listeners of this podcast, of course, because we are all curious about science, and that's why we're listening to the podcast. If you like the Science and Beers podcast, please help us spread the word by recommending it to a friend, giving us a review, particularly if you're listening on iTunes, or just sharing it on your social media pages. You'll find more information about Nina's research in the link in the description. There's going to be a couple more podcasts this season, and then we will be taking a summer break. Next week, I'll be talking with Peter Krostrup, and he's a researcher into the health benefits of playing football. So he has a few different football classes with overweight children, older women, or people recovering from breast cancer. And we're actually going to be meeting up at the Euro Fan Zone over in Copenhagen and having a beer as we watch football, play football, and talk about football. So that's going to be fun. Thanks very much for listening. I'm Michael McGee. Cheers to science.